Welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions. My name is John Wood. I'm your host for this regular monthly series of discussions focused on an article or a book review that's published in the ASA journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. This month, we're going to launch our discussion of the March issue of Perspectives. In the next couple of months, we're going to have something a little different. We're going to choose authors from the God and Nature, or the ASA online publication, God and Nature. And so we start off next month when we'll hear from Beth Madison. She's a soil scientist at Union University, and Beth has written a little piece in God and Nature called 5 Smooth Stones. He's going to be talking about David's confrontation with Goliath, and that should be interesting. And then that will be followed the following month by another article by Jim Bradley on theology, and we'll hear about that a bit later. So today, I am pleased, and we are pleased, to have Gregg Davidson with us to discuss his paper from the March issue of Perspectives, and that paper is called Human Sexuality, Logical Fallacies, and the Shotgun Aim of Arguments from Nature. Gregg, welcome to the Diving Deeper table.
Thanks for having me.
For those of you who don't know, Gregg is a professor of geology and geological engineering, University of Mississippi, and the Ole Miss engineering department. And his specialty is in my favorite area in water. His specialty is in surface water, groundwater, wetland hydrology. Gregg, maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself and something about your faith journey and your journey into this academic discipline that you have.
Sure. So I have a somewhat unusual spiritual journey in that both my grandfathers were Assembly of God preachers. One was a preacher rancher out in Nebraska. We still have a little bit of family land out there in ranch country. And my father was a biology professor at a community college. So I had both that science and Christian faith background. And my grandfathers both appreciated science, and my father appreciated the Bible and Christianity. So I managed to grow up without really any sense of inherent conflict. It wasn't until I started encountering other people that were insisting on conflict that I started to kind of go down that path and begin to look at some of those questions. But one of the things that especially my father, depending on your perspective, either blessed me with or cursed me with, was growing up with a sense of you don't believe someone just because they're in a position of authority. Just because there's some supposed consensus view, that you always probe, you always ask questions. And so it was, on the positive side, that was kind of a Berean mentality, where if you recall the Apostle Paul, when he's talking, he says that the Bereans were more noble-minded than the Thessalonians because they didn't just take his word for it. They searched the scriptures to see if it was so. So that's kind of been my operating mantra through the years. And, even if I didn't want to dive down this science and faith path, especially when you're a geologist, people find out you're a geologist and a Christian, and they ask, how do you make that work? So as I would answer that question, one thing led to another, and of course ended up fast forwarding to 3 books published with Kriegel publications that are science and theology. Had the privilege of co-authoring a book with Kenneth Turner, an Old Testament and Hebrew scholar that's just on Genesis 1, the manifold beauty of Genesis 1. That was actually probably the most fun thing that I have written in my career. So just a very brief synopsis.
Yeah. Okay. Nebraska. There's 2 things there. How do you get from Nebraska to Wheaton, Illinois? And then, did you know about the Ogallala Aquifer when you were growing up? Because I know you know about it now as a hydrologist. So tell us about that. journey?
Yeah, so the ranch land is actually dates all the way back to the land rush that my great great grandfather was part of that land rush.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's all kinds of stories of him that during hard winters he would actually go out hunting and deliver like deer to various neighbors that were having a hard time. Over the years, the land got subdivided among the children to where now we actually I still own a square mile of land out there, but in that in the what they call the sand hills of Nebraska, it takes like 10 acres per head of cattle.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can't support even a single family ranch with a square mile of land. But we still have that. I have a really good relationship with the ranch family that's renting it, and we'll be out there this summer visiting. But I had a familiarity with the groundwater underneath, but as a kid, no, I did not know it was called the Ogallala. But funny thing, fast forward, my parents ended up moving to New York State.
Okay.
I grew up in Central New York. The I went to a public high school, but kind of thought I wanted to go to a Christian college. Picked Wheaton. Wheaton was kind enough to accept me. So graduated from Wheaton, then went to the University of Arizona for graduate work in hydrology.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing led to another. A few years ago, I actually did a research project specifically related to the Ogallala Aquifer. So
Mm-hmm.
my life has had a lot of kind of full circles.
Exactly. Fascinating. We could talk a long time. My great
Yes.
grandfather homesteaded in Nebraska, and so did my grandfather was in the Sandhills. So yeah, lots of connections there, and that is a fascinating. Water is a fascinating metaphor, certainly in Scripture, and the notion of cleansing. There's lots to talk about there another time. But today, I want to move forward to how you ended up in this topic on gender. And I think you've already set it up by saying you're interested in questions. And so tell us some more about this.
So really two things. One is that I have never known how to stay in my lane. That's actually I've actually viewed that as kind of problematic in our society. That in the years ago, people were much more broadly educated, and so if you had people that were struggling with something that might not align exactly with somebody's primary expertise, they had broad enough areas of education and understanding that there was a lot of overlap, and people were caught in that net. Whereas now we've become so siloed that it's possible for somebody to be struggling and, well, that's not my expertise, and they end up falling through the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
So um, I have kind of broken the mold, as it were, of our modern society of saying stay in your lane, and I just don't. So, more specifically to this issue, it really came about as a result of an ASA meeting a couple of years ago, where because ASA is getting proposals sent in for talks, that they're not inviting specific talks or categories of talks in. And so you do have occasions where you get what appears to be very one-sided seminars.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a session that was on human sexuality that was from a particular perspective, and the other side seemed lacking. And I kind of was waiting for somebody else that maybe was more in that discipline to come forward with another perspective. Didn't see it, so decided that from a perspective of the logic of some of the arguments, as opposed to like biological expertise, that this was something that I felt like I could add to the conversation. So, hence
Mm-hmm.
this paper.
That's great, Greg. Thanks for doing that. That's quintessential ASA. We are a bottom-up organization. We let ideas and questions and issues and topics percolate up from the bottom. And yeah, I think over the years, as I've been in ASA, I think we've often, had that experience where it seems like it's all in one lane or in another, and you until you take the whole thing together and listen in the conversation. Um, so that's great. Appreciate you doing that. Um, Today, I think we're going to get right to our first question. And let me see, I've been scanning here. Oh, yes, I see Del Kuhn there. And we had a couple of questions come in. Good morning, Del, and good afternoon, pardon me. And thank you for sending in your question. Dana, if you'd go ahead and I'll give some background on how we're going to proceed. Our practice is to unmute everyone and give you the opportunity. If you go down in near the bottom, you'll find the reactions button, and you'll see on your screen. Typically, your reaction is to raise hand, and if you would raise a hand if you have a question, and then I'll call on individuals as we move through the questions. But we invite questions ahead of time, and we've had two of them. I'm going to open with Dell's question today. But Del, just before I do that, I'm thinking on my feet here this morning, folks. You hear I have a little frog in my throat, and it's migrated to my brain. So, before I do that, Gregg, would you just say a little bit about the context for this paper? Because you had a really delightful introduction, I thought, of how of a friend, of a colleague, and a friend. You didn't say much about that, but could you say a little bit more about the setup for this paper and the question you're addressing? Okay.
I'm not sure what story you're referring to with the friend.
You said, I think you said you had a colleague who has spoken in this area or written in it that you don't agree with.
Yes, yes. So the paper, I it was a little bit delicate
Okay.
because I was really primarily prompted to begin writing this as a result of a paper that had come out in a journal that I believe is called Theologos by three authors that were very much promoting the human transsexual argument
Right.
with these examples from nature. And one of the authors is actually a good friend, personal friend, that for like the last 15 years, kind of a fellow partner in promoting the science and faith mission. And it was, if I'm honest, I found myself, it was a little painful to be on opposite sides of something that's argued very passionately with that friend. The way that their paper was written, they actually did a really good job of kind of encapsulating these examples from nature arguments from multiple different sources. And so it served as a really good platform to say, okay, I'm going to use that paper for a counter argument with respect to the logic of these arguments. So it was a kind of a delicate dance of challenging someone who is a personal friend in print to the best possible way in an ironic manner.
Thank you, Gregg, for that. Because, folks, the reason I asked Gregg, and I'm sorry if I put you on the spot there, these are always delicate for us. We know in the ASA we have a wide range of ideas. Years ago, back in the mid 80s, we moved away from a more specific evangelical statement of faith to a much broader one, incorporating the great creeds of the church. And we've deliberately invited that conversation. And so we know that there are going to be differences in this. And in your case, I really appreciated you saying something. And again, this morning, saying to us, this becomes personal. These are my friends. How do I disagree with my friends? How do I have that kind of fruitful conversation? And folks, I know from talks with the board and from many of you over the years, that is our passion. That's our mission in the ASA, is to bring that conversation together in a, not just a respectful way, but in the way that we are brought up and the way we believe as believers in Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Because after this is who whose we are. We are his. And yet, we disagree about things. And this is another one of those important areas to have these kind of conversations. So, thanks for doing that. By the way, that paper, the journal it was in, which escapes me right now, Hans Mondame, some of you may remember Hans. He was a keynote speaker, plenary speaker in our online 2022 conference. And he and a colleague at Covenant College have responded to that paper. And Gregg, if you haven't seen that, you might actually want to read his theological response, which follows down the lines of what you're doing here, which deals with biological essentialism as a kind of catchphrase. So with that sort of somewhat side remark and preparation, now I will turn to Del Kuhn. And Del, your question deals with the nature of argument, so go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks, John and Gregg. Thanks for the paper. And I guess I just echo what John has just been saying about commending you for the way you handled your arguments in the paper, because I appreciate the fact that you are not making it personal and you're going to the logic of the argument. So my observation is, when we go to nature, quote, for an example, it doesn't tell us. We ask it something, we get an answer, and then it's up to us to interpret it. Whether it's something specific, like I use the example of a protein substrate interaction, or something broad, like animals are territorial. My question is, in any kind of a topic, what do we really expect to get from an argument from nature? And how should we go about our job of interpreting it? Not going into the is-ought fallacy, for example, but nature doesn't tell us something. We ask, then we have to interpret. What do we expect to be getting from it in order to interpret it?
That's a very good question. And I feel like I could go 6 different directions with it. At one level, I think the questions that we're asking nature is just the delight in being able to explore God's creativity. So it's like, what does God's creation look like? And we're asking nature tons of questions to learn what that is. When we're then kind of taking a step beyond that to our interaction with nature and any kind of lessons, I think that there was a point where people might have looked at nature and said, well, is nature just a mirror of humanity, where we expect kind of the morals and ethics of human nature to be reflected in nature? You ask that question of nature, and it doesn't take long to realize that no, it really doesn't. So what does that mean about the character and nature of God? That's not necessarily an obvious answer. There's an interesting path to take exploring a question like that. So once you realize that nature and the things that we consider normal in nature are not necessarily giving us a pattern for human behavior, then I think that raises interesting theological questions about, well, why is humanity so different? Why are there different rules for humans than there are for things we see in nature? And that even takes me to places like, why was Israel selected as a subset of humanity? And they were given particular rules and guidelines that we don't follow all of the guidelines that we read in the Old Testament. And what does it mean to be set apart as humans? What does it mean to be set apart as Christians? What did it mean to be set apart as the nation of Israel? I think those are all fascinating questions.
Yeah, I'm kind of echoing something that you brought out toward the end of your paper, but I can see looking to nature to see how something works, like how our bodies work, how our digestive system works, whatever. Looking to nature to find out how we should act. I think you hit the nail on the head. Humans are different. You use the example of, I think, a lot of, I think it's chimps and other mammals, the alpha male will tend to kill the offspring of the prior alpha male. When people do that, whatever our religious or moral background is, I think hopefully we all drop back into understanding, something like the moral law or the natural law that says we're different. And I realize the topic of sexuality is the question is where is it going to fall? And I'm not going to take I think other comments, people probably know my stand on that, but I'm not going to make the stand on it here. It's really the question of what are appropriate things for us to be, quote, getting out of or modeling ourselves on nature, if there's anything beyond just the understanding of how things work. Open question. I don't have an answer.
Well, and looking at, I think that when we're looking at models in nature and for humans, that clearly there are some things that are very useful, like, when we're looking at physiology and anatomy, that we learn a lot more from studying mammals than we do from studying more distant relations. One of the things that honestly it hurt me a little bit as I was doing research for this and looking at, all right, what kind of behaviors do we see in the animal kingdom that we're not going to try to argue that we should follow those examples, that with dolphins, which are these fun-loving, like they love hanging out in groups. Many dolphins actually seem to enjoy interacting with human beings. And then you discover that like males will like selectively chase down an uncooperative female, corner her, subdue her, and take turns inseminating her. Like, okay, I didn't really want to know that about dolphins, but it's a useful example on why we should not be looking to nature for justifying human behavior.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Del, for that question. Let me follow up on that one because, Greg, you're in an area that I've spent my career in when you touch on behavior, and that was a question that you just addressed that I raised with this is-ought argument. If you take a hard view of that, well, then nature can't tell us anything. But as you point out, in physiology, we've learned lots. We've learned lots in anatomy. We've learned historically, you can just see this developing. And then you touch on behavior, and that's the most recent area. And that we're just trying to figure out how does nature work? And we've only been at that for 50, 60 years, seriously. Darwin certainly posed that question in his writing, his subsequent writing to the Origin. And but it really largely sat there. Human psychology, behavior, developed as an academic field, but animal behavior has been rather slow on the uptake. And in fact, in our community, those of us who are in Christian colleges and universities, I've had colleagues who stress to their students, you are not an animal. We're humans, we're not animals. And I scratch my head at that and I think, well, yeah, from a certain perspective, we're not, but we certainly are. And your doctor thinks you are and treats you as one, as your pharmacist does. And in our behavior, lots and lots of work thinking about us behaviorally. And you said one thing on physiology as a biologist I want to challenge, and that is that, well, mammals are closer to us, and certainly we use rats and mice and primates, right? But we use lots of others. So for instance, on a behavioral side and neurophysiology understanding, well, that comes from my area, invertebrates, right? So we use mollusks regularly and lots of other creatures. So to me, the big question here is that what in the world, what's God doing? This sort of theme and variation kind of thing that's going on. And so getting wisdom into that theme and variation, and I don't think there's a sort of blueprint out there that we can just grab one and follow, because as you said, dolphins with this built-in smile, you just think they're cute, right? When you look at them and we're drawn to them. But oh my goodness, when you look closely, as the primates did. Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey on the mountain gorillas, Godalkis on Britt Godalkis on the orangutans. When Leakey mobilized those three women to go out and look in the 1960s, we started looking, and what we saw didn't always make us happy.
No.
And so I think we're at one of those stages. This is just what I think. It's out there. Is I think we're at one of those stages where we're trying to reach out and understand how does the world work and how do we work.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to imply that like when we're interested in human, that the only things that are relevant are mammals.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
like my friend Jeff Harden, who many of you all know,
Right.
I mean, he's learning things that are of value to even human ethics in the studying of embryos, looking at like nematode worms.
Mhm.
And I just read an article about the development of AI, some of these like really cutting edge neural network kinds of new technologies that are patterning some of their new structures off of like worm brains,
Mhm.
right? They're realizing that for some of the ability of a brain to interact with its environment and to learn from it, that's not necessarily always just something that's as complex as a human brain. So when it comes to behaviors, I have no issues with even looking at some things related to like evolutionary psychology, where it can be informative on what some of the um, like some of the things that are behind what's driving desires and what's driving our just sort of innate interactions with our environments. But it falls short of then saying, what do you do with those
Yes.
drives? What do you do with those kind of natural tendencies? And
Right.
just as a very simple example, I think there is an evolutionary tie to why most men would, if they're just following their nature, are going to have sexual interactions with as many women as possible, right? Preferably the ones that are between 20 and 35 years old, the ones that are most fertile. So,
I
but
know
what
lots of
do we
guys
then?
that doesn't stop, Greg.
Oh, yeah. So, well, no. I didn't mean men between 25 and 30. I said just men in general are like looking for the women that are nubile, right? That biologically are in that child rearing like phase of life. And that's what we as men, most men, find themselves just naturally attracted to. But what does one then do with that natural drive? That's something that nature cannot answer for us. There's nothing in nature that we can go and say, oh, there's the answer. We have to look somewhere else for that.
Well, that's an important point, and I'm going to stop just before I address that and remind folks that if you have a question for Greg and want to jump in this conversation, just use the raise hand function. And I see one now, and I'm going to take that. And then, Greg, I do want to pick up on exactly the point you made because there's two things that come to mind, and that is the nature of sin, and then who, in terms of scholarly disciplines, has the capacity to really speak to that. But before I go down that, Keith, if you'd unmute yourself and Keith Miller and ask your question.
I have a number of questions, but I want to focus on an argument that you made in your paper on page 28. And I'll quote the statement here. It says, the debate is better framed with questions regarding whether the human biological design is constructed around a fixed binary model of sex.
Yeah.
And to me, that immediately maybe think in terms of Linnaean classification. Linnaeus classified things according to what he called archetypes, which he understood as being divinely designed, perfect models for any particular species. And then the species individually were variations on that divine design. And taxonomists and biologists have rightly rejected that type of classification. Because it implies that there is this divine design, a unique design for a given species. I think also inevitably what it implies is that if you accept a as you say a fixed divine design and you have variation, that some individuals are going to be closer to that divine design than others. Okay, and I think this leads into a lot of very difficult moral conclusions. I'm going to tag on to another statement, and then I'll turn it over to you. You say later in that same section of the paper that talking about essentially mutations, that you referred to them as mistakes. And then you say, a mistake of biology does not equate to a devaluation of human value and dignity. And I would argue really strenuously against that, because again, if you say you are a mistake, but God still loves you and I still love you just as much, that's still devaluing the person. That is received by the other person as being, I'm not as good as you are. You're implying you're farther away, I'm closer to the divine archetype than you are. So I'll let you respond.
So first of all, I'll let people know that Keith and I have actually co-authored some work in the past. So we've been teammates on some previous efforts. So Keith, I've appreciated his friendship and the mission for many, many years. So on the specific question, I tried to make a strong distinction between there being the existence of individuals that don't fit neatly into the biological binary versus what is the pattern or what is the design of basically mammals, but more specifically humans, that what does that pattern, what does that design look like? And that, I believe, is quite clearly like XX and female anatomy, XY male anatomy. Then how those characteristics express, obviously there is overlap in, what does an adult male look like? What does an adult female look like? That just because there's that binary does not mean that there aren't overlapping traits and characteristics. Everything that doesn't fit into that, I will actually stick to my guns on those being biological mistakes. And I actually went to lengths in the paper on that very subject of, does a mistake of biology equal something that is less value as a human being, and argued strenuously that was not the case. And you can take any example, not just from human sexuality. I mean, if somebody is born blind, to argue that that's not a biological mistake is kind of contrary to science. It's contrary to medicine, that if we don't recognize that as a mistake, we're not going to try to fix it, right? Why fix something that's not broken? So there are any number of things, and if I could take me as an example, and my eyesight's not getting, has never been perfect, and as I get older, the lenses are getting stiffer, and do you want to call that a biological mistake? I mean, maybe not, but it's not biology operating super effectively. But the fact that that's happening doesn't make me of less value as a human being. So when I look at somebody like Down syndrome, for example, uh, I'm I'm going to acknowledge that there was a genetic anomaly that was associated with that conception and development. But there are Downs people who are wonderful human beings offering wonderful contributions to society. And I would never call them a mistake, even though I'm quite comfortable with speaking in the biological sense of mistakes during development.
Keith, if you have,
May I?
yeah, you want to react? Because I've got my hand up to react to myself. But go ahead.
I guess what I'm trying to say is your language, particularly using of divine design, which,
Yeah.
I mean, when you use the term design, you're in that context, and again, going back to Linnaean classifications, was explicitly a divine design as being a particular state. So anything variation from that is not designed well, as a mistake. If you apply that to humans in that context, it's inescapable that that person who you see as having a mistake is going to feel that they are not being accepted. They're not. You are essentially automatically devaluing them. I don't see any way around that. And I know people that have uh, different genetics and different expressions. Many of them say, I don't want to change. God made me this. I'm a perfectly designed, I was designed in my mother's womb exactly how God wanted me to be designed. And I don't want to change. My blindness or my Down syndrome is what makes me who I am. What makes me, God's design. And it seems to me you're taking that away. So that's my concern.
And actually, I would argue the exact opposite, because what I hear from what you're suggesting is that we completely remove the notion of mistakes, and nothing needs to be fixed. And we don't try to cure illnesses. We don't try to step in and modify somebody's genetic DNA to solve sickle cell anemia. And we leave them in incredible writhing pain because that's how God made them. That was not a mistake. So I actually see the language of removing mistakes as actually moving away from caring for and valuing the human being. And I will add that the idea of, you've repeated the idea of divine design, which I did not use that phrase. I just used design. And yes, I understand how someone would interpret that as this was God's design. The way I was using it more was in terms of the pattern of genetic development. So more like that, if I have the blueprints for a home, that's, whether, who designed that pattern is a valid question. But if we're just starting with those blueprints, a builder may follow the plan, they may deviate from that plan. And sometimes the deviation from that plan results in problems for the homeowner that need to be addressed and fixed. So I would strongly push back on the idea of biological errors or miscues having anything to do with devaluing a human being.
Thanks, Keith. Appreciate that. And Greg, to your point there, Paul, I'll get to you. If you do the raised hand, I'll get to you in a second here. I've got one other. As a biologist, you need to know that these concepts of mistakes and design are fraught, and there's rich literature there, and obviously differences of opinion. And I think, I know when I read it, that a flag went up exactly on this page and on that point, on both of those points. To take it the way you've made it, the strong case that you've made, I think takes us down a path that is fraught with difficulties, because in each of these, what you're emphasizing is we have to make choices in here. The question is, how do you make choice about this? And certainly Keith is right. I mean, on the disability side, I'm thinking about the Down syndrome case you made. Any example, autism, blindness, hearing. There are strong advocacy groups within these various communities that would challenge the underlying premise of what you're saying. And those are voices that are not often heard in our discussions, that need to be foregrounded. And that's one of the important sort of pushback points on this, is that um, is who's doing the talking, who's setting the terms and conditions. I mean, the mistakes thing, got us into eugenics, a kind of simple-minded understanding of natural selection and what Darwin was saying, and all of a sudden we went down a road for a number of years with horrific consequences for all kinds of people. And so, outside of those of us in the natural sciences, the conversations over in the social sciences are rich and deep on these. And as you know, as we all know, those are two communities that have not been in conversation for quite a while. You started out this by saying, it used to be that people had these broader conversations, and we've gone to staying in our lanes so much that it's very hard to have these conversations.
Yeah, I want to push back pretty hard on the eugenics comment, because eugenics had nothing to do with correcting mistakes. Eugenics was all about improving on nature. So they thought they could do selective breeding and cull out the ones that had traits that were less desirable in order to produce a super race. It was not about identifying errors in biology and people who were suffering and try to actually alleviate that suffering. So those are like completely opposite.
Gregg, on that pushback, I just would say you're making the distinction I think that doesn't have a difference. I do think mistakes underlies that entire project. But
I would disagree with that very strongly.
I know we'll agree to disagree.
Yeah, I think there's apples and oranges.
So we have a couple of questions. I'm going to go to Paul Lang right now because he's raised his hand. And then I'm going to go over in the chat. And Liz, if you would be ready to respond, I want to take your question right after Paul's. Paul, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to make two comments and then ask the questions with it. I'm a urologic surgeon, and I've been amazed. And I wrote a paper on the biology of generated sexual preference years ago and gave it to many churches and updated it. But I must compliment all the authors that have talked in perspectives that have unbelievable scholarship and references, including Dr. Davidson. But I am a little worried because I see no people with MDs. I see no people who've actually been in the trenches. When I read it, any evidence that they've spent much time talking to trans people or to physicians who take care of them, including surgeons. I've participated in trans surgery, although I'm mostly in cancer, and of course talked to many of my colleagues which have been in it. And so my first question is, how much interaction have you had with actual trans taking care of or watching the care of trans patients or talking to MDs who take care of it? The second thing I'd like to say is that intersex, we used to call it DSD, disorders in sexual differentiation. And there were conferences lasting hours and days on changing that to differences in sexual differentiation. And the literature on this and where you draw the line between what's abnormal and what's not abnormal is amazing. And the whole subject of neurodiversity, which my understanding is was first put out there for autism. And they talked about not just the people who have dysfunction in autism, but the autism spectrum, like Gates and Elon Musk, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'd be careful about doing that. And I'm not a philosopher, but I've sat there and listened to these lectures for hours on whether it should be disorders, it should be differences. My question there would be, so is autism a mistake? Is is homosexuality a mistake? Or is it part of neurodiversity and just differences? And then when the All of Us project is done and we match all these million people with their genomes, we're going to have unbelievable neurodiversity issues. And I'm just a little worried about labeling things as mistakes. Sure, there are some neurodiversity or even medical diversity things that need treatment. They're dysfunction, but I'm just a little worried about calling them mistakes. And obviously, it's a big issue.
What question would you like me to
Well,
address?
have you interacted with many physicians who actually take care of patients? That's one. And secondly, have you looked at the literature on the arguments about DSD and whether it's disorders or it's differences?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the answer to the first question is that my direct interaction with trans individuals or people that are doing the kinds of medical interventions with them has been minimal. Which I could also say about a number of other ethical issues. So while there would be advantages to having some of those interactions, I would not tell anyone that because you haven't had like what they call skin in the game, that you have nothing to say. On the second one, which was, have I looked at some of that literature? Yes, I have on that. And I recognize that there's a lot of complexities with how one diagnoses something, what they call it, what the recourse is for addressing those things. And in the paper I wrote, I did not get into those. Right? I was sticking with a pretty narrow theme of just the logic of using examples from nature in order to justify certain behaviors. So where one goes from that is another question that I also have opinions on and thoughts that were not part of that paper.
Thanks, Paul, for that question, and Greg for your response. I direct your attention to the chat. Janelle brings up a point about sickle cell anemia, and Greg, I think contextually, sickle cell anemia you could call a quote mistake. It needs to be corrected. However, in context, it's actually having that phenotype is actually protective of individuals against something. And so the complexities of the interactions of organisms in the environment do not lend themselves to these kind of easy, not easy, but these kind of binary choices that often we want on a policy side or on a procedural side. And I know, like homosexuality in animals, it is shot through over and over again, and there are sort of multiple things that are going on there. In some societies, in bonobos, our closest relatives, it's actually reduces aggression, and have this sexuality going on. So biology, the biological community is having real struggles describing, and then coming out of that, and you see these differences of opinion about out of that, what does it mean for us in terms of behavior? But that's why you're getting pushback from those of us who don't like these sort of hard, sort of that's a mistake and that's not, because those decisions are contextual. But I point to Janelle's. I did have another question.
I actually would like to address that.
Go ahead.
So yeah, because I actually mentioned that in the paper, that sickle cell anemia is an example of one of those things that actually did have a benefit. So I actually specifically mentioned its benefit for
Right.
being less susceptible to malaria. Yep. But in terms of a mistake, it's still possible for a genetic anomaly to produce something that has a value, but also at a significant cost. And somebody who has sickle cell anemia, who experiences the excruciating pain. And, addressing the previous question, I have interacted with friends who have sickle cell anemia, and I can promise you that any one of them would gladly take malaria over what they're having to experience. So there's still legitimacy in calling that a condition that is worth intervening for, and simply saying, oh, it's just a normal part of the genetic developmental pathway. There's no need to fix anything. I think leads to like a failure to care for those people, and to actually truly value them as fellow human beings.
Well, your friends are surviving the malaria. It's the 200 million children a year who don't survive it that they don't have a voice on this one.
Point
Anyway,
taken.
we're gonna disagree on that, but we've got two people raising their hands. We're gonna go to Gregg. Steve Kentucky, you were first, and then we'll go to Mark Strand.
I just wanted to point out that we had an article in the same issue by Adam Smith called Gender Incongruence and the Question of Medicalization. Adam's a philosopher, and this article addresses some of the questions that we've all been discussing much more directly than Gregg's article,
Right.
which was focused on critiquing the PNC style arguments.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, for that, because we did say at the outset, Gregg, that your article is constrained on a particular set of arguments. It's not trying to do everything, and we don't want to have you do what you didn't intend to do.
Thank you.
Mark Strand.
Yeah, thank you, Gregg. This has been a good conversation, and I appreciate everybody who's joined us today because we care about this issue. We care about how we handle it within the body of Christ and within the scientific community. So thank you for what you've offered. And so the question is it's not meant to push you into a corner or imply that there's some bias here. But if you were to say, what was the theoretical perspective that would have kind of informed the hypothesis of the paper? Was it more theological in a sense? This is what Scripture teaches, so therefore we need to use that as a bit of a starting point. Or would it be more sociological in that this is what society is now telling us based on experience of people, so we need to think about it from that perspective? Or a third alternative would be fundamentally more in a biological sense, genetic sense. I'm curious if any of those was more informative in your kind of starting point, and they're all legitimate, totally legitimate. And this is a complex issue, so thank you for your work. And I know there's disagreements, but of course there is. This is the ASA. And I hope it's all productive in helping us all improve our understanding and also care for persons. But I would be curious to know if any of those stands out to you, and then if so, which and why. Thank you.
So that's a great question. And it's actually a little bit hard to answer because what drives us to choose to do something is often multifaceted. And it's not always possible to just say it's this one thing. As a Christian who has been intrigued by difficult questions and driven to investigate those, and found, the reason why I'm still a Christian today is because I have found the Bible to be profoundly truthful. So that definitely was a motivating factor in this, on kind of what my understanding of Scripture is, and what I see as oftentimes an erosion of that, but then also significantly coupled with the societal aspects, and not from this sociological study kind of perspective, but just from like being a university professor and dealing with students day in and day out, and seeing the struggles they're going through, and reading things like, if you all are not familiar with Jonathan Haidt's, I believe it's his latest book called The Anxious Generation. I think that ought to be must reading for like everybody in the US, because it's really, he's not a believer, but he does an amazing job of drilling down on some of the drivers behind a lot of these anxieties, these uncertainties, this confusion. And so I think it's the combination of those two that ultimately influenced this paper.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That's a good question. We have a question in the chat, Gregg. It came up earlier, and I'll read it out. and see if you can respond to this. It's about the biological and the binary on. It says, if biological evidence does not support a strict binary understanding of sex and gender, and multiple cultural and philosophical frameworks acknowledge a diversity of gender experiences, so on what logical basis should one particular worldview, especially one that asserts a binary, be given priority in public discourse or policy over others that recognize greater complexity? Now, you can see this is a question that goes right to the political debates of the day, right? This was not the point of your paper. So, right?
And we do have another hour to answer that question, right?
We do not have an hour.
Yeah.
But go ahead and say something.
Yeah. So that is clearly a really, really good question. And thank you, John, for reminding folks that was not something that I addressed in this paper.
Yeah.
So briefly, what I would say is that I am one of those people who values differences in other cultures. So I have never been one that looks at, say, Western culture and said that is the example that everything else is judged by. At the same time, I also recognize the fallenness of human nature and do not believe that all cultures are equal, because cultures are made up of individuals, and the farther a culture has drifted away from the love of God, the more we can expect those cultures to reflect things that are not godly. So if I look at a culture that forces women to completely cover themselves and does a form of circumcision that is specifically designed to diminish pleasure during sex, I am quite ready to declare that is something that is less worthy of being held up as equal to other cultures, and that if our mission is to be where the Old Testament and the New Testament repeatedly says to be looking after the widow, the orphan, and the alien amongst us, that taking part in whatever we can do to protect those people, to protect society from those kinds of things, that we should be called to do. Now, what exactly that ends up looking like, especially in a democratic society, wow, is that a much bigger conversation.
And one that's beyond the scope of what we're doing today, but I do think we can direct our attention. I'm thinking about the answer that you gave sitting on the other side of the border, that border with Canada, that these kinds of questions become highly charged, and they look different from where you stand. And so the statement earlier Paul made about what is our experience with the other, and Gregg, I think that especially with these cultures that we don't agree with fundamentally, that goes right to the heart of the story of the Gospels, of the Scriptures. It's this constant interaction of bumping up against, and how do we do that? And that goes in our direction, I think, goes to a theological answer. And I put in the chat, folks, a recent book called Gender as Love, a theological account of human identity, embodied desire, and our social worlds. It's by Philippe de Valle, who is a theologian at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And what he calls for there is calling to theologians to do a better job of talking to the rest of us about these kinds of questions. And he's really saying we need a theological theology. In other words, do your discipline better. And so, Gregg, this paper that you've responded, I mentioned Hans Mondeme's response to that paper. I think that kind of response is going to be helpful as we continue this conversation, and we get theologians in particular to dig deeply into this and inform us as natural and social scientists. We have lots of opportunity here. We're looking forward into the future. I know Steve Kentakis will invite letters, articles into the journal, certainly on this topic and on others. And so let's keep this in mind. Thank you, Gregg, for this conversation today. I'm madly looking here for my closing. As I said, remind myself that I said that next month we're going to hear from Beth Madison on 5 Smooth Stones. That's an article in God and Nature that was up just recently. And then we're going to be followed with Jim Bradley on game theory and theology. And I'm sure we will get certain conclusions from Jim about how game theory can inform theology. All right, bad joke. Or no joke at all. Gregg, thank you again. It's been good to have you with us. I see Tony Gelsma is online with us today. Tony is also an article in that issue. And we
I had just a little bit of information, John.
What's that?
Yeah, well, just that some time ago I got talked into starting a podcast called The 7 Series with a tagline of tapping the biblical number of perfection in creative ways to explore faith, science, and culture. So that's up to episode 34. I've had some amazing guests, including people like Mary Schweitzer, Luke Barnes, Joel Duff, some really good folks talking about science and faith issues. And there's even one on immigration where I talk with an immigrant about like navigating that biblical command to care for the alien among us. So that's at greggdavidson.com, Gregg with 2 G's. So you can find that and a lot more.
And if you find this article challenging and you'd rather go to a science fiction book, I think Gregg has a science fiction book that he could recommend to us as well, don't you?
4 of them.
4 of, or I thought it was going to be a trilogy. You've got 4?
There is. There's a trilogy, and then there's another standalone. And that's also on greggdavidson.com.
Oh, Gregg Davidson. Okay.
greggdavidson.com.
2 G's,
Okay.
E
Greggg Davidson.com.
2 G's, that's right.
Thank you.
And if you get confused, you can always go to Old Miss. He's very prominent on their faculty page. It's a wonderful source. Gregg, thanks again for this today, and to all of you for being with us in Diving Deeper Discussions. We'll see you next month. Goodbye.
Thanks.